Good morning. It's Friday, August 8th. The multi-front war in the Middle East is now 672 days old. I'm your host, Jonathan Schanzer. Welcome back yet again to the FDD Morning Brief. I'm trying to understand what's happening right now in Israel as the leadership debates next steps in Gaza. The chief of staff of the IDF, Eyal Zamir, is opposed to taking over the entire territory. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu was just ordered the takeover of Gaza City, but the full occupation of Gaza may be the only move that makes sense to him. And get this, he says that Israel should take it over temporarily because he doesn't want to control Gaza long term. But that's not what some of Bibi's ministers are saying. They want to control the place long term, and they're opposed to Bibi's current moves because they look like negotiating tactics to get back to a hostage deal with Hamas. So somebody please explain to me how this thing is going to go work out. Short term, long term, no term. It's all about as clear as mud. Our guest today is Carrie Filipetti. She's the executive director of a great shop in Washington called the Vandenberg Coalition. Before that, she served as Deputy Assistant Secretary for Cuba and Venezuela, as Deputy Special Representative for Venezuela at the U.S. State Department. Today, she's doing great work at Vandenberg to promote strong U.S. foreign policy. We're going to dive in shortly with some of the work that they've been doing, so stick around. Here we go again. Another iconic image of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict that has turned out to be bogus. A photo snap by photojournalist Anas Zayed Fateha depicting starving Gazans turned out to be staged. A wider angle photo in the German press makes this abundantly clear. I wish I could say this is a first. It's not. I recall a photo during the second intifada of a young man bleeding from his head with an Israeli soldier standing over him angrily holding a billy stick. The victim was Tuvia Grossman, an Israeli who had been attacked by Palestinians. The New York Times said he was a Palestinian victim of Israeli violence. Whoops. After that, it was the Mohammed al-Dura affair. A young Palestinian boy and his father were purportedly caught in the crossfire during a firefight between Israelis and Palestinian terror groups. The media reported that the Israelis killed him. Evidence later emerged that it was all staged, but the blood libel had already spread. People jokingly call it Pallywood, Palestinian Hollywood, but it's not funny. The American and international media are fully complicit. Today, Israel is still fighting this garbage. The Times just issued another correction after running a photo of a purportedly starving child in Gaza, only to see that the kid had a muscular disorder. Here's my question. How much more of this do we have to endure before there is even a modicum of accountability? Because we have seen exactly none for a quarter of a century and counting. Now for your headlines. Headline one, the United Nations has finally engaged with the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, or GHF. The UN has been beefing with GHF for months. Apparently, UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres previously instructed senior UN officials not to engage with GHF. Full stop. The GHF threatened the UN's monopoly on food distribution, but with the spotlight on food insecurity intensifying and Israel preparing to escalate in Gaza, the UN's games had to stop. So on Wednesday, representatives from several UN agencies, including UNICEF, the International Red Cross, and the World Food Program, met with GHF chairman and former FDD Morning Brief guest, Reverend Johnny Moore, Trump's former deputy Middle East envoy, Morgan Ortagus, and also another FDD Morning Brief guest was also there. There were ground rules for this meeting. No phones, Chatham House rules, meaning there would be no attribution for anything discussed, and there was to be respectful and polite discussion only. That sounds lovely. I don't even know what that looks like. Nothing much reportedly came from the meeting beyond a decision to tone down tit-for-tat attacks in the media. I'm not sure exactly how this is all going to work out, but I do suppose it's a step in the right direction. Headline two, the Lebanese government approved a U.S. proposal to disarm Hezbollah by the end of 2025. That's coming up very soon. The plan has four phases. First, within 15 days, Beirut needs to issue a decree committing to Hezbollah's disarmament. Phase one will also see Israel purportedly halt all operations in Lebanon. Those have been ongoing, of course. Second, Beirut needs to approve a deployment plan for the Lebanese army, a feckless army at that, within 60 days to help facilitate this whole disarmament thing. Israel will also start withdrawing from South Lebanon and release Lebanese prisoners during phase two. During phase three, Israel will complete its withdrawal from South Lebanon and money will start rolling into Lebanon to clear rubble and set the stage for reconstruction. The fourth and final phase is when Hezbollah's remaining missiles and drones will be dismantled. That seems like too far in the future for me. The United States will concurrently organize an economic conference in partnership with France and, wait for it, Qatar to support Lebanon's economy and reconstruction. You know I don't like that. Get Qatar out of Lebanon and don't let them back in. But here's the part where I also warn you. Hezbollah will not simply refuse to give up its weapons. The Iran-backed terror group said it will go about its business as if the disarmament plan, quote, does not exist, end quote. Which is interesting because if the group tries to do anything too aggressive, the group may not exist, full stop. Headline 3, Israel signed a major energy export deal with Egypt. It's the biggest export deal in Israel's history. In case you missed it, Israel is home to one of the largest deep water natural gas reservoirs. It's called Leviathan, and in 2020, it began exporting gas to Egypt. Yesterday, Israeli energy company NewMed Energy, which owns a 45% stake in Leviathan, agreed to supply Egypt with 130 billion, with a B, cubic meters of gas through 2040. The deal is worth a whopping 35 billion. It'll roll out in 2 phases. The first phase is expected to commence next year, and the second in 2029, once the Leviathan production expansion plan is completed and a new pipeline from Israel to Egypt is constructed. If you tune into the FDD Morning Brief even just a few times, you've probably heard me talk about how unhelpful Egypt has been in Gaza. Turns out some of this may have been a disinformation campaign by Qatar, bought in by some of Bibi's advisors in Israel, but some of it was true. This is a good reminder, though, that Egypt's relationship with Israel isn't all doom and gloom. All right, it's time for that conversation now with Carrie Filipetti of the Vandenberg Coalition, so let's bring her on. Welcome to the program, Carrie Filipetti.
Thank you very much. Great to see you.
Great to see you. All right, Carrie, you are a repeat offender here at the FDD Morning Brief, and we thank you for coming back for more abuse. But for folks who don't remember, just remind us, just for a minute or two, what the Vandenberg Coalition does in Washington and why you guys are making a difference.
We're a pretty new organization. We started about 4 years ago, and it was because we realized that we're in a pivotal moment for our nation and our citizens. The threats against the United States are unceasing, and we recognized over the years, whether it was Pearl Harbor or September 11th, that waiting until those adversaries are at our shores before we address that threat will only lead to more reactionary policies, exorbitant economic costs, more American lives lost. So ultimately, we are a network of individuals that believe that a strong America is a safer America. As we'll discuss, most Trump voters are on the same page. And we essentially create policies to ensure that American lives are protected so that we're never in a position of weakness that our enemies try to exploit.
And that's what makes you a great partner with FDD. And we thank you for all that work that you're doing. All right. So now let's get to this new polling data. What does your new poll say? And I think there have been a couple, if I'm not mistaken. So what are multiple polls saying about American foreign policy?
Yeah, so we started these polls last month, and we've done a few polls before then as well, but this monthly polling process started last month. And the goal is really to assess where Trump voters are on the major news issues of the day. There are so many podcasters, influencers, et cetera, who claim to speak for the average Trump voter. And rather than asking political pundits, we wanted to ask the people themselves. And what we found, this is now the second poll, is a really ringing endorsement of the peace through strength approach. We see that over 9 out of 10 Trump voters believe that it is important for the United States to be the most powerful country in the world. We see 9 out of 10 voters say that it's important for American security that America leads. So not just recognizing that it's better for the world, but recognizing that it's better for the United States as well. And we see large numbers continue to be in support of Israel, continue to be in support of tougher sanctions on Russia for their intransigence in the peace negotiations. And as you would expect, a significant amount of support for President Trump himself and his policies that he's been pushing in for, at least as it relates to foreign policy.
So interesting, because I mean, I can recall from just a few weeks ago, you had Tucker Carlson, or who I like to call Tucker Carlson, comes out and is absolutely furious about American intervention in Iran, and he says, well, that's not what MAGA is. And then you got President Trump slamming him in response, saying, I decide what MAGA is. And of course, I think Trump makes those decisions based on what he believes that his voters believe. And I think your polls seem to underscore all of this. And I think it is important. But I mean, tell us, why does all of this matter? If I'm not mistaken, you and your colleagues believe that this might change the way that Trump looks at foreign policy because his voters' positions may not be what we thought they were. So how do you think this all plays out? I'm assuming you're going to keep taking these polls. If the polls continue to reinforce certain messages, how does this play out into the future?
What it really shows is that President Trump is right when he says that he is the one that gets to decide what MAGA is. To your point about the Iran strikes, in our poll in June, we had asked people if they agreed with Operation Midnight Hammer, which had just taken place a few days before we went into the field. We saw astronomical levels of support for that. And in fact, nearly 70% of Trump voters said that they would support the president if he decided to attack Iran again. Over 90% of Trump voters, and by the way, MAGA voters, self-identified MAGA voters, are highest here. 96% of MAGA voters say that it's critical that Iran not develop a nuclear weapon. So when Tucker Carlson and others claim to speak for this crowd, they're truly not. And it gets a lot deeper than that. This conversation about forever wars that we've seen, we saw that only 4% of respondents said that they were dissatisfied with President Trump's foreign policy because they were concerned about getting involved in forever wars. 4%. So this is a very hawkish audience. The reason we're doing these polls is, one, we want to understand where they are. What do Trump voters really care about? What's motivating them? Because it's a really unique coalition. These are not all Republicans. We know that President Trump cares what his base thinks. He is constantly assessing where they are. So this gives us a good sense and a good ability to share with the president, look, your supporters are behind you when it comes to making sure that America is safe. They want to be protected against China. They want to be protected against Russia. They want to be protected against Iran. And importantly, they really back the president on Israel. Even among younger MAGA voters, where this is where Tucker Carlson and others have said, you have the under 45 crowd, they don't support Israel. That's also not true. We saw 85% of MAGA voters under the age of 45 still strongly support Israel. So this just goes to show that they are behind the president. And we hope that this information will help our friends and partners in showing that there's massive support for their positions, and also demonstrate to the president that peace through strength is the foreign policy that unites his base.
It's so interesting. I mean, I recall when the Midnight Hammer operation began, and everybody began breathlessly warning about the forever wars, as you just mentioned. And then the whole thing lasts for 12 days, right? And I mean, I joked on Twitter or X or whatever we're calling it that this forever war lasted for an entire Scaramucci, right? Like, we're talking about like less than 2 weeks here of war. And of course, all of that falls flat. And, it's funny, actually, Scaramucci even tweeted it and joked about it himself, which I thought was, good of him to be able to laugh at himself a little bit. But, you just get a sense that the messaging right now that's coming out of MAGA world doesn't actually align with MAGA. Whatever MAGA is, and I'm still not even sure. It's kind of like a Rorschach test or something, but there is something really important here that you've put your finger on, and I'm definitely looking forward to seeing more polling from you guys just to put some finer points on all of this. I think you guys are just beginning to scratch the surface, and I thank you for the excellent work that you're doing. You personally, Carrie, have done some work at the UN. The General Assembly, or as I like to just call it, UNGA, it's a beautiful way of describing it, is coming up in September. So what's your sense of the Trump administration's policies at Turtle Bay? Are we about to see some much needed change, some house cleaning? We've been hearing about it for a while now. First Trump administration, the first 5-6 months of the second Trump administration. Is there going to be a reorg coming, a defunding, a hammering of the UN? What's your sense?
Yeah, I certainly think so. I mean, Mike Waltz, who should be heading there shortly, hopefully, he has said that he is going to take a sledgehammer to the United Nations system. I think President Trump has been really clear. People say that he's dismantling the international system. I think what he's really doing is he's recognizing that that international system has failed to achieve its core objectives. He believes in the principles founding the United Nations, but they have gone so far afield from that. In the first administration, we had spent a lot of time working on reform, trying to reform PAHO, trying to reform the World Health Organization, trying to reform a dozen different entities within the United Nations system. That didn't work. They were very resistant to change. And so we ended up leaving many of those entities. And President Trump already back in February announced that we would be leaving many of those, UNRWA obviously being the most dominant, UNESCO and others. So I think that what we've seen with DOGE and others is what was once reform in Trump's first administration is now dismantling in his second administration. I think he has given them the opportunity to make these changes. They have not made the changes. They are constantly being used as a cudgel against the United States and against our allies and against Western civilization, which is what they were there to protect and defend. So hopefully we will see that sledgehammer come forward as it relates to multiple different specialized technical agencies, which, as you know, have been taken over hugely by the Chinese Communist Party. We have seen how they've taken over the General Assembly through their debt trap diplomacy. So I suspect that President Trump has a lot of interesting ideas in store that will hopefully rejigger the system to be more aligned with where we are. But if not, I wouldn't be surprised if he ends up leaving multiple different entities within the United Nations system.
Yeah, and I will say, I mean, I was talking earlier about the GHF and what's going on in Gaza, and you've got all these agencies that I think are directly threatened by a U.S. engineered entity that is going to potentially break their monopoly on aid distribution. You get a sense that they're fighting, that it feels almost existential for them, that if they lose that full control for aid distribution, that they're in, that they're going to be in deep doo-doo, as my colleague Ruel Marc-Correct often says. I also, I got to just ask you on the World Health Organization, the WHO, as we call it. I mean, that one feels like one of the biggest problems that we have, primarily because it looked like it was running interference for the Chinese Communist Party in the immediate wake of the COVID outbreak. And so, I mean, do you get a sense that there's any one agency? I mean, the WHO seems like a big one to me, but is there anyone that you have your eye on right now that looks particularly vulnerable to a Trump dismantlement strategy?
I'm curious, we've already left UNRWA, obviously. We're no longer funding UNRWA, but that doesn't mean others aren't funding UNRWA. As far as I'm concerned, UNRWA has given so much support to terrorist organizations like Hamas over the years. Over $1 billion have been siphoned off. They knew it was happening. UN Watch has reported on how the former head of UNRWA, who's now the head of the International Red Cross, which gives some explanation for why they have not focused on the Israeli hostages, he had been meeting with and praising Hamas leaders. So I kind of wonder whether or not they're going to go harder against UNRWA, declare it a foreign terrorist organization. If you were to do that, the whole thing would have to collapse because then others would be subject to sanctions if they end up giving aid to UNRWA. And there are other alternatives, as you mentioned, GHF. It's really important that the UN is not responsible for aid distribution in Gaza. We're seeing what happens when the UN is responsible for aid distribution in Gaza. So I do wonder whether they're going to start using more aggressive options, as well as what we saw, the use of sanctions against individual UN envoys who have been against the United States or against Israel. I was pretty surprised that the Trump administration issued these sanctions. It was an innovative approach. I'm not sure if we've done that before, but that's really important as well in ensuring accountability for individuals. And so these people don't seem to care until they're themselves targeted. And so I think we'll see a lot more of that as well.
Yeah, of course, you're referring there to Francesca Albanese from the UN Human Rights Council. That's, well, actually, she was the special rapporteur on the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. And then you have the three members of the Human Rights Council that all resigned in succession after Albanese was hit with those sanctions. And when you talk about UNRWA, I mean, I am curious. We have this entity in the United States. It's UNRWA USA, and it's a nonprofit that's operating in Washington that looks a lot like a lobby organization. I would love to see that thing shut down. All right, last question before I let you go. What about the Southern Hemisphere? I know that you've done a lot of work in this space. And I noted that Secretary of State Marco Rubio spent a lot of time in Latin America early on in this administration. It seemed like every phone call that he was taking early on was directed south and not east. In other words, he wasn't engaging with our European partners and allies that were traditionally those first phone calls that a Secretary of State will make. So I guess my question is, do you see the making of a different kind of foreign policy from the Trump administration as it relates to the Southern Hemisphere? Are we trying to clean up our own backyard before we go elsewhere? What's going on?
I mean, that seems to be how they've been phrasing it. It was this big joke in Latin American circles that America First was America's first when he first started. But what we're really seeing is pretty difficult to give a overarching strategy to. When you look, for example, at Venezuela, which is something that Secretary Rubio has cared about throughout his entire career, we most recently, just yesterday, issued a $50 million reward program on Nicolas Maduro because he is the dictator there. But we also, the rumor has it that we have given oil licenses to Chevron to keep operating there and benefiting the regime. So we're seeing a lot of this back and forth within Latin America. One thing that I thought was really interesting from our poll is we asked if people were supportive of giving support to pro-American dissidents. So I'm thinking of people like Maria Corina Machado in Venezuela. 67% of respondents, so 67% of Trump voters said they're all for it. And that was as high as 80% among MAGA voters under the age of 45. So I'm hoping that the administration will look into some of its more soft power pro-dissident activities, whether that's related to Venezuela or Iran or elsewhere, and reinstitute those, because it's very clear that that's something that his voters support.
All right, we're going to leave it there. I want you to keep up that good polling, keep up the good work. Carrie Filipetti, thanks again for joining us today on the FDD Morning Brief.
Thank you so much.
All right, good stuff there. Here's what FDD has on tap for you today. My colleagues Mark Montgomery and Leah Siskin published a piece in Bloomberg Law discussing the flaws of the Trump administration's long-awaited Artificial Intelligence Action Plan. The AI plan is designed to accelerate the development of AI while addressing its associated threats and risks. Leah and Monty, as we like to call them, applaud the plan for refusing to shy away from hard truths, but they caution that many elements of the framework remain underdeveloped and overly idealistic, if not simplistic. Next, check out FDD founder and President Cliff May's latest column in the Washington Times assessing President Trump's view of Russian President Vladimir Putin. After years of seeing Putin as cooperative, Trump is starting to look at Vlad a bit more critically, thanks in part, at least this is what Cliff says, to First Lady Melania Trump's influence. The question is, will Trump do what it takes to persuade Putin that the costs of fighting on in Ukraine are just too high? Let's hope we start to see some change. Finally, FDD's Max Meislich has a piece in the Jerusalem Strategic Tribune about Hezbollah's abuse of the Lebanese financial system. Last month, Beirut banned banks from dealing with a Hezbollah-linked shadowy financial institution called Al-Qard Al-Hassan. This was a welcome move, but Max points out that there are more shady entities to tackle in Lebanon. He identifies another bank that is ripe for U.S. sanctions. It's called Middle East and Africa Bank, and it's a major financial enabler of Hezbollah. More sanctions, please. That's it for today, folks. And that's also it for the week. So, for a weekend dose of FDD, check out the expert analysis on our website, read our quick takes on X, or watch the videos we post on Instagram and YouTube. And yes, you still can make that incredibly generous tax-deductible donation anytime at fdd.org/invest. Tune in Monday for another gripping, riveting, and can't-miss episode of the FDD Morning Brief. Have a great weekend. Until then, I'm Jonathan Schanzer, as always, signing off for FDD.